Lesson 6. In this presentation, we'll be discussing adjectival nouns, and under verbs, the past progressive English tense and its counterpart, the imperfect tense in Greek, as well as the past augment, the imperfect endings, and the meaning of the imperfect tense. In both English and Greek, adjectives may be used in place of nouns. For instance, this is from one of the Gospels, "For you always have the poor with you." Here, the adjective poor is being used in place of a noun. It's functioning as a noun. It's an adjectival noun. In English, such adjectival nouns must be preceded by the definite article. Here we have the in front of the word poor. Adjectival nouns in English usually refer to kinds of people. So the poor, the rich, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You get the idea. In Greek, adjectival nouns are very, very common. Hoi hepta sapoi. Here, our adjective is a form of sapos, which is wise, of course. We have the definite article hoi in front of it, nominative masculine plural. And then hepta, which is the word for seven. It's not a declinable word, so we don't see it change form there. We don't actually have a noun that this adjective is modifying, but we know from the number and the gender that we're talking about men, a group of people. So we would translate it as the 7 wise men, even though we have no word for the men here. We also see adjectival nouns used in additional ways in Greek, though. For instance, we see them used in the singular, whereas we hardly ever see an adjectival noun used in the singular in English. But an example of this would be hasapos. So very similar to hoi sapoi, the wise men. This would be the wise man in the singular. And again, the number and the gender of this expression here, ha sapos, nominative masculine singular, tells us that we're dealing with a wise man. We also see adjectival nouns used without the article. For instance, sapos would be not the wise man, a particular wise man, but just a wise man, someone who happens to be wise. We also see adjectival nouns used in reference to things as well. In English, we seldom, if ever, see this. In English, adjectival nouns are usually used in reference to types of people. But in Greek, we might see something like ta agaton. Here we have a form of the adjective agatos, good, but the ta and the ending of the adjective here indicate to us that we're not talking about a person, but about something in the neuter, of the neuter gender. So we might translate this as the good, kind of in the abstract, or even sometimes as the good thing, but that's less common. We might also just translate this as good, good in the abstract. What is good? That which is good. So that's in the singular in reference to things. We also might see ta agata. And here we're no longer talking about a single thing, whether a single concrete thing or a single abstract thing, but a group of things. So we might translate this as good things. We might also see this without the definite article, as just agata. Now, you can see that there's a lot of variation here, a lot of possibilities. We have to pay careful attention to number and gender in particular, and we have to be kind of flexible when it comes to the definite articles. Sometimes we'll see them where we'd expect to, sometimes we won't. Now, let's turn to something a little different. Tenses. These are the tenses we have learned so far, the present and the future tenses in English and Greek. Today, we're going to take a look at these two. In English, the past progressive, and in Greek, the imperfect. In English, we form the past progressive with an auxiliary verb, in this case, the past tense of the verb to be, and by adding ing to our verb. An auxiliary verb is literally a helping verb, and when we form this tense in English, we use the helping verb to be, a form of the verb to be, and then add ing to our verb stem. For instance, I read would be in the past progressive, I was reading. There's our form of the auxiliary verb to be, and then the ing at the end of the stem. I am reading would be the present progressive. We actually have progressive forms in all the different tenses. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with progressive forms of all the different tenses in Greek. In English, we use the past progressive to indicate that something was in the process of taking place when something else happened. This is one of the uses. For instance, I was reading when the phone rang. I was doing something when something else happened. We also use it simply to emphasize a process. I was working on my car yesterday. Nothing in particular interrupted that process, but I'm focusing on the process as I describe this work. I could have said, I worked on my car yesterday. That would have been true as well, but here I'm presenting that activity under a certain aspect, a progressive aspect, a processual or processional aspect. The imperfect tense. In Greek, the imperfect tense is formed in the following way. Again, this is the counterpart in Greek to our past progressive. First of all, let's take a verb like πάω, I stop. We're going to take the stem of the verb, of course, as we usually do. We're going to drop the omega to get πάω. We're going to add what is called the past augment. An augment is just something that makes something else bigger or longer or increases it in size of some kind. That in Greek is going to be the letter epsilon in most cases. So we add the past augment to the stem of the verb. Then finally, we add the appropriate imperfect ending. We're going to see some new endings today. In the first person singular, it's going to be on. Επάω. This means something like, I was stopping. Again, it corresponds, for the most part, to our past progressive tense in English. Let's talk a little bit more about the past augment. In Greek, all verbs in past tenses, like the imperfect, receive the past augment. For verbs that begin with a consonant, the augment is simply an epsilon at the beginning. For instance, a verb like pera, I bear or carry, and petra, I persuade. We're going to drop those omegas to get our stems, per and pet, and then all we're going to do, because both of these stems begin with consonants, we're just going to add the epsilon as the past augment. And to conjugate these verbs the rest of the way, in the imperfect tense, we would add our endings. We're not going to do that right here. For verbs that begin with a vowel or diphthong, however, the latter, that is the vowel or the diphthong, simply lengthens. So our verb here is akouo, I hear, I listen. We're going to drop the omega to get our stem, and we notice that the first letter of our verb here begins with a vowel, an alpha. And rather than adding an epsilon, which would make it very difficult to pronounce, eaku, we're going to lengthen that initial vowel. And alpha happens to lengthen too. Here the rules are special. Eta. Eku is what happens when we augment this verb stem for past tenses. Now, this is a chart of what happens to these initial vowels and diphthongs when they lengthen in the past tenses. So as we just saw, alpha, epsilon, and eta lengthen to eta, and so on. These aren't things you want to memorize. This process is only so common. I'd say the ones on the top are definitely the most useful. Usually we're going to see verb stems with vowels or diphthongs at the beginning lengthening to eta in these past tenses. And that's definitely true of the first few verbs we'll be seeing. But this is a chart that you might refer back to at your leisure. I believe it's also in the grammar somewhere. Let's look at the present indicative active of πάω. Just the I stop, you stop, he stops, we all stop. What we're going to do is, of course, add our past augment. We're going now from the present tense to the imperfect tense. We're going to add our past augment, which is going to be just epsilon because our verb stem, πάω, begins with a consonant, just like normal. And then for our endings, we're going to ditch most of the ones we have. We are going to keep first and second persons plural, though. And actually, epau amen and epauete are the imperfect forms. So we don't have to do much there. In the other persons, though, we're going to add on in both first person singular and third person plural, which introduces some ambiguity, of course. Are we talking about I who was stopping something or they who were stopping something? We'll have to tell from context. And the second and third persons, epau es and epau e, with the movable nu right there. So again, these are the forms of the imperfect indicative active. Epauon, epaues, epauen. I was stopping, you were stopping, he, she, or it was stopping. We'll talk more about the meaning of the imperfect in just a minute. I was stopping, I used to stop, something we also see. You were stopping, you used to stop, etc. These are the imperfect endings. Like its English counterpart, the imperfect describes a past action in the process of taking place. E ku amen tu sapu. So here we have the first person plural imperfect form of the verb akua. We see the lengthened eta there. The lengthened alpha, which lengthened into an eta. And we would translate that verb right there just by itself as something like, we were listening. And then when we have our tu sapu in the genitive, we know that this is the person to whom we were listening. And sapu, if you can tell, is an adjectival noun. We don't get a noun that this adjective sapas or sapu is modifying. So we were listening to the wise man would be an adequate translation of this. The imperfect is sometimes also used where we would use the simple past. For instance, the sentence above, we were listening to the wise man, that's in English the past progressive. In the simple past would be, we listened to the wise man. But we're going to see how this works in practice. To look at the next example sentence, we need to learn this little word here, ha. It's a form of the relative pronoun. We might translate it as what. We're going to see how that works into this sentence. Ar eques ha elegon. Ar, of course, is a particle that tells us we're dealing with a question. Eques is the second person singular imperfect form of the verb akua. We might translate this just in the abstract as you were listening. And the ha is again this what, and the elegon would be, again, the imperfect tense, first person singular or third person plural. We're going to take it as the first person singular. I was saying. So one way to translate this, very literally, would be, were you hearing what I was saying? But this should sound to us in English as highly unidiomatic, highly unnatural. This is not a good translation. Rather than translating these imperfect tense verbs as past progressive, were you hearing, I was saying, a better way would be to translate them as simple past. Did you hear what I said? Just so happens that in Greek, they use certain verbs in the imperfect where we would use them in the simple past. Verbs of saying and speaking and expressing and thinking in particular. For the Greeks, these activities always represented processes for the most part. Occasionally, a verb in the imperfect should be translated as started or even tried to. So not just I was listening, or even I listened, but I started to listen, or I tried to listen. For instance, ekuamen ton barbaron. Here we have the first person plural, imperfect form of the verb akua, ekuamen. We were listening. And again, the genitive of whom we were listening to, ton barbaron. But rather than translating this as we were listening to the foreigners, the barbarians, We might translate this as, depending on the context, we tried to listen to the foreigners. And we would know from context whether or not to translate this in this way. If we had something that followed this, indicating the failure of the attempt, then we would know that this was an attempt and not an actual successful process. So we're going to have to translate the imperfect pretty freely. We're going to have to pay careful attention to the context and be aware of the alternatives available to us as writers in English. For the forms of the imperfect tense, for the endings, you can look at page 62. Thank you very much.